From The Times and The Sunday Times, this is The Story. I'm Manveen Rana. It's a sight that's becoming increasingly familiar. Donald Trump sitting down in a big yellow chair by a roaring fire. It's the new face of White House press conferences. But what he's saying is anything but usual.
We're going to have Gaza. We don't have to buy. There's nothing to buy. We will have Gaza.
What does that mean?
No reason to buy. There is nothing to buy. It's Gaza. It's a war-torn area. We're going to take it. We're going to hold it. We're going to cherish it.
Trump has doubled down on his plan to take over Gaza and turn it into a Riviera-style resort, complete with hotels and presumably golf courses.
And we're going to run it very properly, and eventually we'll have economic development at a very large scale, maybe the largest scale on that site. And we'll have lots of good things built there, including hotels and office buildings and housing and other things.
After more than a year of devastating war, with thousands dead, nearly 2 million displaced, and homes turned to rubble, the president had no qualms about telling the Gazans their land was no longer their own.
The Palestinians, or the people that live now in Gaza, will be living beautifully in another location.
Sat next to him by the fire, looking increasingly uncomfortable, was the King of Jordan, one of the states where President Trump wants to relocate the Gazans. He pointedly refused to endorse the plan.
King Abdullah, what do you think about the U.S. taking over the Gaza Strip? Do you want to see the U.S. own the Gaza Strip?
Well, I think, as I said earlier, the president is looking at Egypt coming to present their plan. As I said, we will be in Saudi Arabia to discuss how we can work with the president and with the United States. So I think let's wait until the Egyptians can come and present it to the president and not get ahead of ourselves.
Countries in the Middle East are now scrambling to come up with a plan that's more palatable than President Trump's hostile takeover of Palestinian territory. Will it work? Or is Gaza set to be the next home of Trump Towers? The story today: Trump's Riviera plan for Gaza.
I'm Josie Ensor. I'm the Times and Sunday Times' US correspondent based in New York, and I spent 6 years in Beirut as the Middle East correspondent.
Josie, take us back to over a week ago now, and to a press conference that Donald Trump was holding at the White House with the Israeli Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu. Just describe the scene. Were you watching?
Yes, I was watching, as I needed to do a kind of snap analysis. Both leaders were in the Oval Office in the White House. They did this impromptu Q&A with journalists after their official address. And it was sort of one of those marmalade dropping moments where Trump was essentially announcing what was the largest ever shift in US policy in the Middle East, and something that went against widespread international consensus on this issue.
The U.S. will take over the Gaza Strip, and we will do a job with it, too. We'll own it and be responsible for dismantling all of the dangerous unexploded bombs and other weapons on the site, level the site and get rid of the destroyed buildings, level it out, create an economic development that will supply unlimited numbers of jobs and housing for the people of the area.
And whatever previous US leaders had said privately, I mean, here was Trump saying it out loud, and you had Netanyahu sitting next to him, nodding and smiling along wordlessly. I mean, wasn't really answering any questions, seemed like obviously happy with what he was hearing. But I mean, we understand now that while Trump was not speaking off the cuff, it's something that he had told Netanyahu, hours before that he was going to say, but actually he'd had very little conversation about this policy with some of his closest aides.
Tell us what this jaw-dropping policy was.
Yeah, so he has suggested that Gaza, a strip of nearly 2 million people, be cleaned out, to use his words. He wanted this to be turned into essentially a business project, a riviera in the Middle East.
We have an opportunity to do something that could be phenomenal. And I don't want to be cute, I don't want to be a wise guy, but the Riviera of the Middle East, this could be something that could be so bad, this could be so magnificent.
He said Israel's neighbours, Jordan and Egypt, should resettle the inhabitants, that the US would run it. The plan seemed kind of both ill thought out and also like he had predetermined it. So he talked about housing the world's people in this kind of reconstructed Gaza. Then it was mostly Palestinians, then it was temporary, then it was permanent. So in many ways, it was kind of very off the cuff.
I envision a world, people living there, the world's people. I think you'll make that into an international, unbelievable place. And I think the entire world, representatives from all over the world will be there, and they'll live there. Palestinians also. Palestinians will live there. Many people will live there.
And just describe the reaction when he said that. As you say, for many people watching, it was a marmalade dropping moment. But what about the people in the room? How was Netanyahu responding to this?
Yeah, I mean, there was almost an audible gasp in the room among journalists many of whom, had either travelled from Israel or are based in DC, who I guess weren't expecting this. I mean, Trump had said something similar a couple of days earlier, but it was very much unplanned and unscripted. People weren't really taking him at his word. So for this to be said and kind of written down as policy in the Oval Office was quite surprising. The reaction back in Israel was something very different, went down exceptionally well with Netanyahu's kind of more extreme right-wing members of his cabinet, like Finance Minister Smotrich, who essentially has been calling for this sort of displacement and resettlement of Palestinians for a long time. And my initial take of it, and it's something I wrote in my analysis, is this was essentially a speech for one man, that this was throwing Netanyahu a lifeline that he needed just exactly at the moment he needed it, as he's trying to convince, other members of the government to subscribe and get on board with this multi-part ceasefire deal.
So although he didn't have much of a speaking part, more of a nodding and smiling part, this was an amazing move for him. It helped him keep his often unruly coalition together at home. It made some of the more extreme elements in his government very, very happy. What about the Palestinians? What was the initial response from the Palestinians and the Arab world?
So I think it was a mixture. There are lots of Palestinians in Gaza who, to them, the idea sounded so outlandish and ludicrous that they just sort of laughed it off. For them, hearing these comments, it would have kind of taken them back to this idea of the Nakba, the kind of catastrophe that happened to the Palestinian people when they were moved off their land as part of the formation of Israel.
I swear the US president, as far as I'm concerned, and from my point of view, is talking nonsense. Gaza is neither a property, nor is it a house, nor apartments, nor investment buildings. Gaza is Gaza. Gaza is being destroyed. We've been living in it since the day of judgment. His words are in vain. We are living and steadfast, God willing.
So, you see videos of people, Palestinians in Gaza, trying to rebuild, living amongst the rubble and the unexploded ordnance that, America has talked about. And, these are people who are not going to move easily. I mean, some of them said that they'd rather die than leave their land because they understand the precedents of what that means, that if you leave, there is absolutely no guarantee that they can come back.
And presumably anger around the Arab world.
Yeah, so the two countries that Trump mentioned specifically were Egypt and Jordan. Egypt was very quiet. It was sort of strange because he said, I'm talking to King Abdullah of Jordan and I'm talking to Sisi. It was on the Sunday, he said, I'm talking to Sisi. And what was strange was that...
Prime Minister of Egypt.
Yes. Although he said he had this call with Sisi, the Egyptian officials totally denied that this call happened. So while they didn't offer any official comment, what the embassy in the US did do is it sort of slyly reposted an opinion piece that the embassy had written in 2023 at the beginning of the Israeli offensive. and kind of reiterating their position that the Palestinians had an inalienable right to return. Jordan was quietly totally rejecting it, as it has done the whole time. The former deputy foreign minister of Jordan actually went so far as to call it a declaration of war on the Arab people. And Saudi said much the same thing, and sort of it kind of built up this sort of Arab firewall against Trump's plan.
At first, everyone thought it was such a shocking statement. It couldn't possibly be true. Perhaps Trump had misspoken. They weren't sure how seriously to take it. Since then, though, he's been out speaking again, and he seems to be doubling down. Tell us what he's been saying.
Well, what's interesting is I think the germination of this idea that he wasn't serious sort of came from how it first was made public. So this wasn't in a press conference. It wasn't in a briefing with other world leaders. I mean, he essentially revealed this almost off the cuff and by accident. I mean, journalists were on board Air Force One over the weekend, a couple of weekends ago, and they probed him about a call that he had with King Abdullah, in which he sort of revealed what he said to him on the phone.
I said to him, I'd love you to take on more, because I'm looking at the whole Gaza Strip right now, and it's a mess. It's a real mess.
So you'd like Jordan to house people from
I'd
Gaza?
like him to take people.
And then it was the press conference with Netanyahu, and since then he's kind of been gradually ramping up this rhetoric and firming up on certain details that were very hazy before. And what's been interesting is various members of his administration, his aides, even the White House spokesman, Caroline Leavitt, I mean, they've been walking back the most controversial bits of it, and then Trump obviously was unhappy that they were speaking in his name, and he went back on Fox and said, the Gazans would not have a right to return, that they were now under US ownership, contradicting what, members of administration had just told media the day before.
In the meantime, I would own this. Think of it as a real estate development for the future. It would be a beautiful piece of land.
Would the Palestinians have the right to return?
Spent. No, they wouldn't, because they're going to have much better housing, much better. In other words, I'm talking about building a permanent place for them, because if they have to return now, it'll be years before you could ever, it's not habitable.
And, the last thing that he said, which is sort of the ultimate ramping up in rhetoric, is he's issued this ultimatum, which is essentially that Hamas must release all of the Israeli hostages by Saturday midday, or all hell will break loose, as he said.
And we'll wait and see what happens there. We'll come back to that in a moment. But before we do, as you say, this is something that at first people weren't sure how seriously to take it. But it does seem to be something he's thought through. I know you've been looking at where he may have got the idea from, what the backing is of this idea effectively. Tell us a little bit about that, because I know a lot of it seems to be inspired by an academic report written by an American Israeli. Tell us a bit about that.
Yeah, it's interesting because he might not have the strongest grasp of what this plan is, but, there are reports that he was given a pretty detailed plan, particularly back in the summer, one of which was by this economics professor at George Washington University. And not much has been written about it. So I had a look at the original report, which is 49 pages long. And what's kind of striking to me is that there's various phrases that he uses in the report that I've heard members of administration use since then, sort of out-of-the-box thinking. The definition of insanity is repeating the same thing over and over again, expecting different results. And there's sort of like an eerie comparison of some of the things this economics professor has written about. But essentially, some of the talking points that Trump may have picked up from this is that Joseph Pelsman, the professor who used to work for USAID, he talks about having to rebuild every inch of it. So every square mile of it needs to be dug up.
So to go back to this project, and so we wanted to think of a way of, is there a solution post-war? The answer is there is, but you have to really destroy the place and start from scratch. But it requires that the place be completely emptied out. I mean, literally emptied out, dug up from scratch, and then you can reuse all that cement. In other words, the idea is you can reuse the cement and it's not such a big deal. But at the end of the day, when we calculated the cost of reconstructions, we're in the trillions of dollars, not billions, trillions.
This idea of a timeline of 5 to 10 years of reconstruction costing anywhere from $1 to $2 trillion. I I mean, the report is very, very detailed, from medium to long-term survival, economic survival of Gaza. So he talks about a People's Republic of China-style high-rises on the eastern side facing Israel, and then condos essentially on the Mediterranean-facing side on the west. He talks about it being run on solar panels, kind of away from Israeli energy. He doesn't use the same language of displacement that Trump has really gone on to focus on. But he also doesn't satisfactorily answer the question of the Palestinian right of return. He does talk about, Egypt gets so much in billions and billions of dollars in aid from the US, and it should take some responsibility for hosting. But I mean, there are many, many parallels between this report that hasn't really been analysed in detail yet, that I think has some significance.
Does he bring up the idea of ownership?
They talk about a civil administration and a 50-year lease. It's an economic report, so all of the language, it sort of completely takes out the kind of sovereignty of the Palestinians and the kind of emotional connection people have with their land. And so it's totally stripped of this and sort of presented as a kind of a model for reconstruction and a business plan, which is essentially speaking to Trump as a real estate developer. He talks about, voluntarily allowing Gazans to leave, but as I said, there's no discussion about a kind of a guarantee of their right of return. So I think there's a sort of deliberate avoidance to talk about the reality of what a lot of this means.
And in terms of a lease, is that a lease that America would take up, or would America be leasing the land to other people?
Yeah, Trump says that's what he wants, for the US to own it, to be leasing it. I can't imagine that's something Netanyahu would want, territory being owned by America. Aside from the legality of it, I don't think that that's something that he wants. I think if you present him with the facts, he talks about there's going to be $0 going into investment, $0 going into rebuilding it from America, but yet we're going to own it. So it's very unclear the reality of what that means, because you can't have a lease and spend no money. So I think he likes to say that the US will own it, but if you actually look at the practicalities of just how much human and financial investment that means, it's impossible, it's unworkable.
And we'll get on to the legalities in a moment. That's a whole other minefield. But in terms of Donald Trump's mind, as far as we can guess it, he does seem to see this a bit like his sort of talk around Greenland, of basically owning a patch of land that isn't already America. And interestingly, the man he's put on the ground, his envoy to the Middle East, is a real estate developer. Tell us a bit about him.
So Witkoff is extremely interesting. I wrote a profile of him recently. So he's in his 60s, his mid-60s, a bit younger than Trump. He's an old golfing buddy of Trump's, who is originally from an area of Long Island in New York, who now lives in Florida, and he made his millions, if not billions, in real estate investment, a lot of which in the Gulf. So he's taken this very kind of business-first approach to the whole thing. But what's really interesting with him is he obviously managed to successfully negotiate the ceasefire deal, which had eluded Biden's team for 15 months. You have to look at why. He's been incredibly uncompromising with both sides. And what's interesting is I've read some incredible quotes from his first and early meetings with Netanyahu. Witkoff is Jewish, so I think that gives him an amount of leverage to talk to Netanyahu in a certain way. And so, apparently he was coming straight from the Gulf and he wanted to have a meeting with Netanyahu, and he calls off his office on a Friday and says, I'm going to be here at this time. And his office, this is all power games. His office tells him Netanyahu can't meet you on Friday evening because of the Shabbat plans. And Witkoff tells him, we all know that Bibi's flicking light switches on a Saturday. So I think they kind of wield this language of business and power in a way that...
Flicking light switches, and that already doesn't really uphold Shabbat in the way that somebody who is very observant would.
Exactly. So he's basically talking to him on a level and saying, you can't mess with me. Don't pretend. I'm here. He says, Trump wants this done and I'm not leaving until it's done. I think there was something to be said for that approach in the region, that people really listened. And I think, people have made a lot of the fact that he's maybe compromised because he has so much investment in these Gulf countries that he's now talking to. But it also means that he's much more willing, I think, to sit down with both sides. And he said this. Israelis are being a bit critical of him because he says that he's willing to sit down with both sides in a way that hasn't really done before. And he also went to Gaza. I mean, he was one of the first officials. I mean, granted, it's a period of ceasefire, so it's much safer for him to have done it than his predecessors. But I mean, he went onto the ground and saw for himself what was there. And so I think it offers him maybe a more human perspective on this that Trump doesn't have.
Despite his envoy's success on the ground, Trump's latest plan for Gaza is causing ripples of fury across the region. We've been talking about our understanding so far of Donald Trump's supposed plan for Gaza, hugely controversial and in many ways unworkable as it seems. One of the biggest stumbling blocks it must come across is the legality. Just tell us about that. I mean, how legal would it be for America to suddenly step in and own a patch of land and to displace all the Palestinians who live there?
I mean, I don't know where to start. The United Nations, the ICC, various Geneva Conventions, they all make it very clear that the forcible removal of a people from their land would essentially be textbook ethnic cleansing. And Trump can't just take over somebody else's territory and other people's territory, and nor can Israel cede it to the US. I think we need to make that clear, that under no basis can he essentially reoccupy parts.
It's not really Israeli territory to cede.
No, I mean, Israel occupies it, but it doesn't own it.
And so legally, how does he even begin to make the case that he can just take it over?
I think when it gets down to it, that's going to be the sticking point. I mean, since 1967, Gaza has been occupied by Israel by what international legal bodies consider to be illegal. So even if America makes a deal with Netanyahu to take Gaza, I mean, there's no legal underpinning for that. There'll be no recognition of it. And, you know, essentially the Palestinian people themselves are the only people that would allow Trump to do that. And I think Trump is going to get a rude awakening. It might not be today, it might not be tomorrow, but I think when you're reckoning with decades and decades of an intractable conflict, he's going to come unstuck at some point.
And Josie, as you said, you know, every institution that upholds international law would tell you that this is textbook ethnic cleansing. One of those institutions, though, is the ICC, and that, for example, Trump has already sanctioned. Is that his attitude? I mean, does this give us a glimpse to what Trumpism is going to be? Does he just ride roughshod over international law? Does that become irrelevant?
So I think we need to just spell out that neither the US nor Israel is actually a member that recognises the ICC as a court, although crucially Palestine does. I think bullying a sovereign country like Jordan or Egypt or Saudi Arabia, he's going to quickly find out that, you know, the same laws don't apply. I mean, you have an international conflict with many powerful stakeholders. I mean, there are going to be consequences to some of the things that he's suggesting.
And that's part of the problem with this for Donald Trump, is going to be how it's met in the region. Stepping back, tell us a bit about that, because if we're trying to understand how Donald Trump sees the Middle East conflict, I suppose we could go back to his last administration. Back in 2020, he thought he had a plan for it all with his son-in-law. Just remind us a bit about that.
Yeah, so I think his son-in-law, Jared Kushner, was kind of crucial to this, because I don't think Trump has a very good grounding of the region, and he doesn't have a kind of a natural sense of where the US should stand. And so people like Jared Kushner were advising him in the first term. His plan for the region was to bring Israel into the kind of the Arab world fold, normalize ties in a way that it had done with Egypt and Jordan, get trade going. And essentially this was a kind of a bulwark to America's enemies in Iran and elsewhere. And we've seen the last 4 years of that policy kind of acting out. So we have seen a very emboldened Israel in the last 4 years.
And yet that the objective of the Abraham Accords, the idea of normalizing relations between Saudi Arabia and Israel, that's still a goal they're trying to get to. How is that going with these new announcements? I mean, where do the Saudis stand on Donald Trump's plan for Gaza?
Yeah, so, I mean, Kushner and his private investment business has been doing a lot of dealings with Saudi, has got millions, if not billions, in investment. And, you know, Kushner first laid out Trump's articulation of this sometime last year. He made a speech at Harvard University. He talked about, he wanted to do his best to move people out, clean it up, as he said, talk about the beautiful waterfront property that he was going to open up to international investors.
In Gaza's waterfront property, it could be very valuable. And so I think that it's a little bit of an unfortunate situation there. But I think from Israel's perspective, I would do my best to move the people out and then clean it up. But I don't think that Israel has stated that they don't want the people to move back there afterwards.
Yeah, so he floated this plan. He called it the deal of the century. It was essentially that Israel would annex 30% of the West Bank. It would try to entice the Palestinian Authority there by offering it $50 billion in economic aid. I mean, it didn't get off the ground for the same reason that we'll probably won't see Trump's plan get off the ground. But it all speaks to kind of a real seriousness among many in Trump's orbit to make this happen.
And how is that playing out? I mean, what do the Saudis make of Trump's recent rhetoric?
I mean, the Saudis have had to be very, very careful. They've kind of already committed. After Trump was inaugurated, Saudi announced that it would be investing billions in dollars into cooperation and military contracts over the coming decades. So Saudi is in an enviable position. I mean, it's kind of seen as a sort of Sunni powerhouse in the region and the greatest protector of Palestinians. But at the same time, the country is becoming inexorably linked with America, and it has so many business and trade ties now that it makes any decision it makes very, very difficult. On the one hand, if a country like Saudi completely capitulated on what is essentially seen as the kind of unifying cause of the Arab people, I mean, I don't think this would play well for him at home or domestically. And so Saudi, much like Egypt and Jordan, finds itself in like a very, stuck between a rock and a hard place.
And in terms of Jordan and Egypt, those are the countries where Donald Trump says he wants Palestinians to be removed too. Just explain, given your understanding of the region, just explain why that would be such an impossibility for both countries.
Yeah, I mean, when we talk about this rock and the hard place, I mean, neither country can afford to do what Trump is asking. I mean, but also neither can they afford to defy him. So to go on, it is the most incredibly sensitive issue in the region. Jordan already houses millions of Palestinian refugees that were displaced during what they call the Nakba and later in 67. And while they've been given citizenship, there's, tensions that occasionally spill over, and King Abdullah is very, very aware of that. And, having to potentially house another million and completely destabilize the population. And at the same time, acknowledging that it's forever dooming the prospect of a Palestinian state, it's a red line for people like Abdullah and Sisi in Egypt and Saudi Arabia. And they're in an impossible situation. I mean, the US is their third largest trading partner. They can't afford to lose the aid and military assistance that they're given, but equally they understand that what is being suggested could even lead to their own downfall. It could lead to such strife at home that it's almost a calculation that has to be made that it's not worth it. So I think Abdullah, Sisi, MBS, they're hoping to convince the Trump administration to back down from what they're asking, or they're hoping that there's room for another solution, because it's so unpalatable. He's suggesting that they just cannot possibly agree to it.
And these are countries that are allies of America's in the region. By risking destabilizing them, this could backfire for America.
It could, and it could also undo all of the work they've done for the Abraham Accords. So, if they see the cost is too high to them, they might back out of a normalization deal with Israel. All the kind of stabilization work that's been done over the last 5 years completely crumbles. And it's just not in anyone's interest for either of these countries, which are, as you said, like America's strongest allies in the region. It's in no one's interest for them to be destabilized.
From what we can tell, is this a Donald Trump negotiating position? Is this just that he's going to come up with a maximalist plan that will bring everyone to the table? Or do we think he's serious about pushing through with this?
There's no one who understands the conflict, who's speaking to both sides of it and not just one side, that thinks that this is in any way workable. And if you take that premise that this idea is a non-starter, and there is a temptation to get hung up on it because Trump's bombast leads and misdirects us to that. I think what we're seeing is essentially Trump, what he's doing is setting out a position that's so radically extreme that it becomes a bargaining position, as he has done in many of his own business deals. I mean, we look also at last week's tariff I mean, they called it a trade war, but this is not what Trump's intention was. He sets out a maximalist, as you say, an extreme approach to achieve something maybe much more modest. And so I think what Trump wants from this is he has a far broader ambition, and that is to kind of reshape the entire region, the Middle East, in line with US interests. And so what we're not going to see probably a resettlement of all of Gaza's 2 million Palestinians. I think what we will see is maybe a radically rechanged and realigned region where America's interests are the number one interest of the region. And so he's creating a distraction in order to essentially just increase influence in the region.
And Josie, we're all watching with bated breath, the clock ticking towards this deadline on Saturday. Donald Trump has said if Hamas doesn't release the hostages by then, all hell will break loose. Something that Benjamin Netanyahu has now repeated. Do we have any idea what that might mean?
I mean, for Palestinians on the ground, when they hear all hell will break loose, and they're, sitting among 30,000 unexploded ordnances with no roof over their heads, it's quite difficult to imagine for them what all hell breaking loose means. I think there was an interesting caveat in that, is that Trump essentially then said it's actually down to Netanyahu. So while he said all hell will break loose, he also insinuated that it's essentially what Israel decides to do. And so I think what we'll see is a ramping up of pressure for this ceasefire to work, and both sides reaching a point where they're in agreement. Who knows what happened for the second stage of the agreement, but I think it's in everyone's interest for now to see the exchange of hostages and Palestinian prisoners and for that to go ahead. But Trump likes to set deadlines, he likes to set deals, he likes to see that things are done. And so I think this is another example of him ramping up the pressure and really forcing both sides to do a lot of discussion that they otherwise wouldn't be made to do. So, you can criticize his approach, but we'll see what gets done in the end.
That was Josie Ensor, our correspondent in New York. For all the latest on this moving story on Trump and the Gaza plan and the Middle East's counter-proposals, we'll have all the details as soon as they're published at thetimes.com. The producer today was Edith Rousselot. The executive producer was Fiona Leach, and sound design and theme composition were by Mal Lassetto. If you'd like to get in touch with us about this or any other story, do drop us a line to thestory@thetimes.com. Thanks for listening. See you tomorrow.